Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is April 30th. On this day in 1904, 32-year-old Mary McDonald was found critically injured near the Big Four railroad tracks in the Cumminsville neighborhood of Cincinnati, Ohio. Her death wouldn't just shock the community, it would quietly become the first in a string of murders later linked to an unidentified killer. Today, we're going to talk about Mary McDonald and the mysterious killings that rocked Cincinnati at the turn of the century. Let's get started. Mary McDonald was originally from Saginaw, Michigan, but she was living in Cincinnati in 1904 and was boarding with a woman named Mrs. Finley on East 7th Street. Friends knew her as May or Mamie. By most accounts, Mary had a tough life. She battled with alcohol use, and by the spring of 1904, she seemed to be going through a pretty rough patch. On the evening of April 30th, Mary visited her sister and brother-in-law, Charles Stagaman, at their home in the Cumminsville area. The three shared 3 buckets of beer together. Later that night, Charles said he offered to walk Mary to the streetcar stop at Knowlton's Corner, but instead of heading straight there, the two stopped at a few saloons along the way. Each of them reportedly had 5 whiskeys. They left the last bar sometime after midnight. According to Charles, he helped Mary onto a streetcar and watched her leave. But for some reason, she got off just a few blocks later. And what happened next remains unclear. In the early morning hours of May 1st, a train engineer named David Shoemaker spotted something unusual near the tracks. A woman slumped against a telegraph pole. He assumed she was drunk, and as his train passed, he shouted a warning, but she didn't respond. About 2 hours later, as the train made its return trip, conductor James Flavin saw what looked like a body lying near the same spot. When the crew went to investigate, they found a horrific scene. The woman's left leg had been severed above the knee, and her head had sustained a serious contusion. Her clothes were torn, but she was still alive, though just barely. She was rushed to City Hospital, where she briefly regained consciousness and gave her name to staff. But it wasn't enough to save her. Mary McDonald died a few hours later. The initial assumption was that she'd been drunk and stumbled onto the tracks and been hit by a train. But investigators quickly noticed that her head injury, a blow to the back of the skull, looked more like an assault than a fall. And that changed everything. At first, Mary's brother-in-law Chuck stuck to his story. He saw her off on the streetcar, and that was the last time he saw her. But streetcar conductors working that night said that they didn't remember anyone matching Mary's description getting on or off. And that raised suspicions. Police considered the possibility that Charles had lied about seeing Mary off and that something had happened after they left the bar. And then there was the injury to her head. The coroner noted that the bruising appeared to have occurred before her leg was severed, suggesting that she might have been unconscious or already dying when the train hit her. Some reports even mentioned a bloody rock found near the scene, though that was never officially logged. Despite these leads, the investigation stalled. Mary hadn't been robbed, and there were no signs of sexual assault. With little to go on, authorities were left with theories. Was this a drunken accident? Was it a random act of violence? Or was it something more deliberate? In the months that followed, the story of Mary McDonald might have just faded into obscurity, but it didn't, because just 5 months later, another woman was found dead, under eerily similar circumstances. 19-year-old Louise Muller was attacked on the grounds of Spring Grove Cemetery, not far from where Mary had been found. Her skull had been crushed. There were no witnesses and no suspects. Then a month later, it happened again. 24-year-old Alma Steinigwig was found murdered in almost the exact same location. The same brutal head trauma and the same lack of motive. By the time 2 more women, Anna Lloyd in 1909 and Mary Hackney in 1910, were found with similar injuries, a terrifying theory had begun to take hold. Cincinnati had a killer who was targeting women. The newspapers dubbed him the Cumminsville Killer. Others called him the Cumminsville Ripper. Whatever the name, the pattern was clear. Female victims attacked with blunt force trauma, sometimes with their throats cut, and usually in isolated areas. There was no sign of robbery and no clear motive. And Mary was the first. But back in 1904, police didn't really think in those terms. The concept of a serial killer wasn't even part of the public vocabulary. Forensics was limited, and investigative standards were loose at best. And Mary's own struggles with alcohol made it easier for her death to be dismissed. And so it wasn't until later, until more women were found dead, that Mary's case was revisited and seen for what it likely was: the beginning. We still don't know who killed Mary McDonald, or Louise, or Alma, or the others. No one was ever charged. No forensic evidence was preserved. The case remains unsolved more than 120 years later. But by revisiting stories like Mary's, we can better understand how these crimes were handled, and often how they were mishandled. We can see the gaps, the missed chances, and the women who paid the price. Mary McDonald wasn't famous. She didn't come from wealth or power, but her story matters. She was the first victim in a string of brutal killings that terrorized a city and still haunted in some ways to this day. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!